Well, I presume I've seen 90 people now, participants are here. So I have a feeling we're just letting people in as we go, folks. So welcome. If you happen to see 4 beautiful thumbnails on your screen at the moment, one of them is talking to you. My name is Mark Collard. And yes, it is a very different setup to the past, Cassie. This is an actual webinar as it's described by Zoom. And I distinguish a webinar from a meeting, which is probably what you've done most often. I know certainly most of my events of this nature have been like that as well, have been more like a, more like a meeting as we go. So while we're waiting for people to arrive, I see us over 100 now, so we've made the century. I'm going to ask you a series of questions as we wait for people to gather, and I'm going to ask the panel for the same information. No need to use the chat room, but I'd like you to consider a series of scenarios, panel and attendees, as we wait for people to gather. This first one is to ask you if you had a preference in terms of waterfront. Would it be beach or the pool? Beach or the pool? And you can talk to this. You don't put it in the chat room. Just consider what I know for me is the beach every time. I live in a country with 36,000 kilometers of beach. I'm told I have about 100 meters of it is all mine. It's rarely ever the case, but how about for you folks?
I have a healthy fear of sharks. So I will say that although I love the beach, I won't get in the water.
Good. Well, I'm going to now go for it, Austin.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm less than a minute walk to our beach, our cove, where I can put my kayak in. So I think the ocean is where I like to be, and the choppier the water, the better.
Good.
Wow. Well, you're brave, Austin.
So I've now launched the poll. Go ahead, attendees and panel. It is all anonymous. Tell us if you had a choice between beach and the pool. Just click the option that is most suitable for you. I'll give you a good 10 or 15 seconds. Don't worry if you missed something. We've got at least 100 people who have already responded here. And I'm going to give it another 3 seconds. 2, 3. I'm ending the poll and I'm sharing the results. Congratulations. We are a beach-loving people. Well played. All right, let's go to our next question. I would like you now to consider which money pattern describes you. Is it to spend or to save? Which one describes you best? Which one describes you best?
Is it for work or is it personally?
That's a great question, isn't it, Michelle? Anything, just general. I know it always depends, doesn't it? So just generally, are you a spender or more of a saver? Which is the discipline that tends to be your dominant preference?
What do you think, Claire?
I think I'm a saver.
I am a saver.
A saver with the odd splurge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a spender, and it's a good thing I have a fiscally sort of good management partner who can help keep me on track.
I'm a saver that spends often. Does that count?
All right, go ahead and conduct your poll now. Do you spend or save? Are we spenders? Are we big spenders? Is it hard to keep the money in our pocket, or do we tend to save? I know particularly in COVID-19 times, we tend to save up maybe a little bit more. Let's see, I'll give it another 3 seconds.
Yeah, before COVID, save. Now spend. That's what some people say. Before or after COVID.
All right, okay, we'll end the poll there. Don't worry if you've missed out, and I'll share the results. Well done, a group of savers.
Ooh.
So we love to be the pool and we save money. Congratulations. Let's just skip right into this next one. I love this question. Which of these 2 roles would you prefer? To be the star player on the losing team or the bench player on the winning team?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah, that's why I like to ask them.
That's a good one.
You want to be on the losing team or the winning team, with the star player or the bench player? Bench player means you never got out onto the field, by the way, regardless of your sport. So which one is it going to be? Star player on the losing team, bench player on the winning team. We're coming up to our official start as we wait for people to arrive, folks. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. All right, give you another 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. Well played. Ending the poll there and sharing the results. We're all star players. Bad news is we all lost. But well played.
Yeah.
Good news.
But we played well.
We played well. We played well. All right, let's give this one more. Let's go for this one. It's not one I've ever done before. Which of these two situations would you prefer to be? The elephant in the room or a fish out of water?
Another great one.
Elephant in the room.
I will choose
or a
fish out of water.
Out of water.
Yeah. I'll choose fish out of water for sure. Yeah, how big is the room?
I'm pretty frequently the elephant in the room and not, I think my opinions take up a lot of space, so I apologize.
Appropriate self-disclosure, please, Austin.
I can concur with that, Austin.
Thank you, Claire.
You're welcome.
3 more seconds. 1, 2, and 3. We'll end the poll there. And sharing the results, we love to be fish out of water, whatever that might mean. And these are great questions, as you could appreciate, whether you're in person or have a virtual audience, just as we've done it now, to have a bit of fun. We've certainly engaged people and maybe woken people up if you've got up very early in one parts of the world. But we may have also learned something about others as well. So we're a beach-loving, saving, fish out of water. What was the fourth one? Oh, but a losing, benched. No, the star players.
Star players, yeah.
On the losing team. Fantastic. Okay, folks, welcome. Let's make an official start. My name is Mark Collard. My absolute pleasure to be here with 3 other gorgeous people who you can probably see on your screen. If you're new to this platform, there will be a spot towards the very top right-hand corner where you can look at the speaker view or the gallery view. And by all means, it's your choice which you choose to do. But if you have gallery view, you'll see our 3 other panelists and plus myself. First of all, thank you. Thanks particularly to our panelists who have gone to some effort to prepare for today's presentation, but thank you for turning up. Some of you are getting up very early. If you're in India or parts of Southeast Asia, it's early here in Melbourne where Claire and I are based. And then we have Michelle and Austin who are in the United States where it's the end of your day. So thank you. Whatever you did to arrange your day today to be here, we're really grateful for that. This is being recorded. So if for any reason you need to dip out or for those who perhaps couldn't get in, it will also, there'll be a link being shared with you so that you can get access to this later on. We have a lot of really great content we're going to share with you. And so that's also a very useful reference that you can come back to later on. It continues to be free and accessible after the event. I did try to live stream this. I think it's still stuck in a perpetual load, so it does not seem to be going. Here's what we found. And when I reached out to these 3 beautiful people, was it close to 3 months ago? We all had this first tsunami wave of interest of people saying, oh my goodness, what do I do? Groups can't turn up. I now have to do this online. How do I now adapt to this new normal? So it's basically taking stuff that the presumptive setting of people turning up and can touch and and now we couldn't do that. That was the first wave of interest. And I know Michelle and I and many others have produced lots of great content to help people adapt and answer some of those questions. And now, with the easing of restrictions around the world, we've noticed now the inquiries are switching to, okay, how prepared are we to maintain people's health and hygiene and physical distancing measures when people return in person? And that's, of course, different across all parts of the world. So that's really where our focus is today, folks, is to answer that question. What do we now do? What do our programs look like in a post-COVID-19 world? Whether that's tomorrow, it's next month, next year, whatever that might be. None of us are experts. We've had a little chitty chat. I think we're also broadcasting this, though, for the extra bonus points for those who are really early. You got to hear all of our little chats at the start. We're also in it with you. We probably bring a different level of thinking to it, given our preparation today, but we're not experts. We're here to share, and I'll speak more about that in just a moment. But you will note that I asked you a question when you first registered, and roughly 2/3 of the people who are watching right now are in the completely unprepared or somewhat prepared boat, which is perfect. If Claire, Austin, Michelle, and I completely stuff up, we're going to turn over to the 5% of you that said you were totally prepared, because you clearly have all the answers. So when we get to the Q&A, we look forward to your contribution when we get to that part of our session. It's not prescriptive. We are not here to tell you what to do. We're really going to have to understand that the conditions vary throughout the world, and the guidelines, frameworks, rules, whatever you want to call them, are naturally very varied. So don't look for a prescription, otherwise you're going to be disappointed today. So this is really less about being right and more about being aware of what you know and what you don't know. I know myself personally, trawling through the frameworks and guidelines that have been put out by different organizations, some of which we'll share with you here today. I was like, ooh, didn't think about that. Hadn't thought about that. So that's really what each of us plan to inspire you to think about, is those things that perhaps you're aware of and maybe not so aware of. You also have my permission, to borrow a phrase from a couple of my friends, Chad Littlefield and Will Wise. You have our permission to utterly misinterpret everything we say and share to suit your situation. So everything, so that it suits you. Only you can make those decisions. We hope that we inspire you and fill you with some more information. So we're going to share, we're going to shift your thinking and just think about what is possible. So anything to add before, well, maybe I should just introduce our panel at this stage, who have been very, very kind to allow me to open up the preamble here. Can we all just point to Michelle? This will only work for the panelists, of course. So Michelle is right there now for me. So Michelle Cummings will be familiar to many of you folks. She's the big wheel at Training Wheels, which is a fantastic organization that creates wonderful training workshops and fantastic resources for team builders all over the world. And between Michelle and I, we've probably had hours and hours of Zoom time, right, Michelle? You know,
Yes,
sharing
absolutely.
in the last sort of 2 to 3 months. So it was a natural choice to invite Michelle into this space. Then we have Clare, no particular order, but point to where Clare is, also in Melbourne, Australia. Oh, I forgot to mention about Michelle, is that we share the same initials. We're both MC. We love that. And we share the fact that early in the 2000s, Michelle had her very first trip to Australia, and that was the very first time we got to meet. Ordinarily, we only get to see each other at conferences, which is a bit like Clare and I. We see each other at conferences, but we have never actually worked together. Clare is, and I've got the notes here to get this all right, the Director of Risk Resolve and Executive Director of Research and the OEG, or the Outdoor Education Group Foundation. OEG, for people who are outside of Australia, is Australia's largest private provider of outdoor education programs in the country. And so you can imagine what's happened in the last 3 months has been a massive hit on their business, but a preeminent organisation in terms of the work they do. And in particular, Clare, apart from being an Aussie, was the first recipient of the International Reb Greg, let me get this right, Wilderness Risk Management Award in 2018. And she was the first person to receive that outside of North America as well. So big kudos to you, Clare. A lot of great stuff there to share. And then there is Austin Paulson. Austin he's directly below me. Yep, he's pointing at himself as well. He's based out of Boston in the United States and works as the Director of Training and Consulting at Project Adventure. He loves tech and high altitude climbing. Now, we met 30 years ago when I was a very green intern, my 6-month intern at Project Adventure, and Austin was a challenge ropes course builder back then. We have done many things in that time, and now we find ourselves back in the same space again. So welcome to all of our panelists. Each of them will have a chance to share with you. Again, there will be some things that we could share with you on screen, or otherwise it's just to the camera. All of this is being recorded. Take notes as you go along. If you've got questions, you will note that within the settings here at Zoom, you just simply need to nominate the questions, and then you can look at other people's questions and vote them up or down. When we get to about the 10 minutes to the hour sort of mark, we'll look at those questions that got voted up and aim to address some of those questions. So at any point, feel free to do that. You can also have side chats on the chat room if you choose as we're presenting. But if you've got a question, we're probably not going to be monitoring the chat room itself, but we will look for those polls for the questions as we go through. Okay, panel, are we ready to go?
I'll monitor the chat box a little bit. I've been answering a few questions that have been popping in there a little bit. So so I'll do that unless it's my turn to present, but I'll be kind of monitoring in there a little bit as well.
Fantastic. That's the benefit of co-facilitating, hey, Michelle?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to share my screen to get us started. And oh, here we go. So while at the moment you're probably just seeing a little thumbnail of each of us as a panel, but there are 3 screens, and I want to just share a little bit about some of the best practice guidelines. And if any of this makes sense to you, take a screenshot of it, or if you need to, wait for 24 hours and you'll get the video recording of this. But this is just a précis. I've picked the bones of stuff that I have found the most useful in my research around best practice, around what would a COVID-19 program look like, and then 2 other screens that relate particularly to screening, and then some of my favorite activities. The first part, if you look at practice or best practice, there's kind of like good, better, and best. So one of the issues from a COVID-19 perspective is equipment. Of course, if you pass something over to somebody, there is the chance that you are also spreading something, in this case, a COVID virus. So the best practice, of course, is to have a no props program, which is fine, of course, unless you need props to be able to run it. But let's start from the base to understand that having no props at all is a great way forward. If you need props, then your next option would be to consider, could those people bring their own? So if you're running a rock climbing, could they bring their own harness? Therefore, they're not sharing that harness, or bring their own helmet, or even their carabiners, or if it's a paddling trip, their own paddle, or their own PFD, their personal flotation device. So think of what props could be possible for people to bring. And even if they all can't bring them, if some of them can, that goes some ways towards eliminating some of that spread. And if it is possible to assign equipment, assign it to each person. So if they're with you for a week, maybe that PFD is with them for the week. I'm going to scoot through this fairly quickly. All of this we can give more detail at another time. You want to minimize the physical contact, obviously, as much as possible, but limit it to short periods. So if there's a lot of problem solving going on, maybe that can be conducted at distance. And then when the problem needs to be solved, bring people together for a short period of time, respecting as many of those measures as possible, but only for a short period of time. Keep groups small and minimize the mixing of members between groups. This is something I hadn't thought of. It's like, oh yeah, because it would be important that if we're going to restrict the spread, if the spread is only within a group of 6, that we're not breaking that group up and having them break up into other groups. So keep your group small and try to minimize the number of times you mix them up. Same goes for the instructors for each of those small groups. If possible, and this works for many of you, more than a third of you are outdoor educators or experiential educators. So if you can, outdoors works best because it's open air. But if you're inside, then you want to have spaces that have ample airflow. My son is now back at school. So Australia has returned to school in most states now, and all the doors and windows are open. And, so they're indoors, so they're dry, but it's a bit cooler than normal because they want to have that natural airflow. So consider that as a way to minimize the spread. This is something that we use in Australia, 4 square meters per person. So if you're running an indoor program, calculate the square meters or the square feet and identify how many people is going to work to have in that space. We're working on the basis of 4 square meters per person in Australia. You want to manage and monitor the flow of exits and entrances. You might notice this at lots of shops these days. One way to come in, another way to go out. Makes sense because that way you limit the opportunity for people to be passing each other. And you want to communicate and monitor those hygiene protocols, washing hands regularly, disinfecting surfaces as frequently as possible, positioning hand sanitizers in all the high traffic flow areas. As I said, we're not being prescriptive. We're giving you a few ideas to consider in your own programs, how that might look for you from here. Specifically now, I want to look at participant screening. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it hits on some of the common themes. Well in advance, you want to communicate early what you're doing to be able to ensure the hygiene, health, and physical distancing of your participants. So communicate that really early to your clients, your campus, and so forth. If you can, screen the people in advance. It's too late once they've arrived off the bus and someone answers a question in this next set that said, oh yeah, that's me. It's too late. You've already sat in the bus for the last half hour. So if possible, ask people to declare to the best of their knowledge these at least 4 or 5 things. Have they been diagnosed with COVID-19 in the last 14 days? That's an obvious one. Are they in quarantine? So they probably don't think they have it, but they may be in quarantine. It's important that you're aware of that. They've not been overseas in the last 14 days. Have they been in contact with anyone who has or is being tested for COVID-19? Think families or where they might live or their guardians. And they do not live in a household with someone who is displaying flu-like symptoms. Again, none of us are doctors typically, so we need to go to the worst case scenario to understand, ooh, could this be a problem? And then importantly, whatever you're doing to screen people, keep those declarations and their contact details, because for tracking and tracing purposes, if we discover post the program that someone actually did have the virus, we need to let all of those other people who are in that same space know at that time as well. So the piece that I wanted to share with you is around the screening, some of those really basic understandings of those measures and how it might apply to you. And now I want to apply it to just 3 activities, some of which I'm sure you're very familiar with. The first one is crosstown connections. For those who are not familiar, it's where you've got a large group of people, you go find a partner, possibly they're random, and you exchange some form of physical greeting. High five, fist bump, oh, there's a billion of them. Naturally, a lot of people in a small space all at the same time. So that's probably the easiest thing to solve, is to be able to invite people a lot bigger areas to make that shifting, and then make it an extra challenge. As you're moving between partners, maintain a distance. I've even seen this where everyone is holding a hoop, a hula hoop. They have to hold it out to the side of them, and they cannot get any closer to the point where the outside of their hoop would touch somebody else's hoop. And so that was also respecting their physical distancing. And then when they saw each other, maybe an elbow tap is okay, because you can't put your elbow anywhere near your face. Although, to be honest, you could touch your elbow and then touch your face. Maybe that's not a good idea. So maybe you want to go with the no touch option completely. The bow, maybe it's a wink. It's a tips your hat. It's g'day, mate, or it's a curtsy. There are so many non-contact ways of greeting people. The essence of the activity is the same. And for those who are not familiar, the idea is, having suggested 3 or 4 or 5 of these, how quickly can you go find your individual partners, respecting their physical distances, and greet them before you move on to the next person. Jump in, jump out. A lot of people are very familiar with this. As you can see in the picture, people typically hold hands. It's kind of fun because when someone jumps the wrong way, when they went left and they should have gone right, you end up, having a bit of a giggle. I've done this before post-COVID times, that where you don't hold hands at all. For example, I work with communities where touch is not possible. And so you just simply jump, and you have at least 1.5 meters or 6 feet apart from each other. The giggles are still the same. When someone jumps left and they should have gone right, all right, technically, they probably got a little closer to some people than should have, then just make the circle even larger. Or create lines, semi-quasi-military formation, as I call it, where everyone is separated. It's exactly the same activity. Not everyone can see each other, but that's another way you could use your space for that purpose. And then finally, and this is going to be a segue to Michelle's presentation, a lot of you will be familiar with Ubuntu cards. People are familiar, you can see the pack there. There are lots of things that we do, particularly with group games, that involve some sort of a low or prop activity like a card, and Ubuntu is one of them. You could not use the cards at all. That is, remove them all completely. That is a no props program. But if you really like them, and there are ways to use it, you could, of course, choose to use them, but in addition, wash your hands before, use them, wash your hands after. That would be one way of doing it. And then put them aside for at least a week. The current research suggests it could live on the cards for up to 3 days. Let's go easy. Let's make it a week, and then use them again. So you might need to have several packs up your sleeve for that purpose, or don't bother. They cost $20. You've used them now, and maybe you then choose to recycle it. So that's clearly a cost involved, but it'll be one of those things that you could consider doing. Which leads me to another way in which those cards could be used from a post-COVID perspective. But I'll stop that sharing there. Panel, anything to add before we throw to Michelle to pick up from there? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Either that or
as far as the Ubuntu cards or spotted cards or whatever works, I now am going to laminate everything, because I've already laminated. These are spotted cards, but they work the exact same as Ubuntu cards, and I now have laminated everything, because then I can disinfect it. So and usually I give everybody, for a lot of the activities like in Ubuntu or with Spotted, everybody gets one card, and then sometimes you trade cards and go find a new partner. So I think instead of doing that, what I'll do instead is everybody will get their 5 cards for however long they are, for whatever activities I'm going to be doing. And then those 5 cards, they can either go home with them, or if I've laminated them, then I just have, you know, everybody place their cards somewhere around the room to where then when we go to collect them, I disinfect them as I'm collecting them. So that way they're ready to go the next time I go to do I wanted to use them. So, and laminate is, here in the United States, there's a company that I get all my laminate from called laminationdepot.com. And I have scoured the web for the best lamination deals. And so I don't know if they have a vendor for like a lamination warehouse of some sort over in Australia or in the whatever part of the world you are viewing from. But even if you went to like an office supply store, that sometimes they have services to where you could have things laminated. So, and then personal laminators aren't that expensive. If you wanted to pick one up at a local office supply store, should have those as well. So, so that's kind of one of the things that, you know, one of the tips that if you are going to still use props, a couple of I have 3 or 4 activities I wanted to walk through as well that I plan on doing. I actually have I have 10 facilitators coming over to the Training Wheels warehouse this upcoming Saturday, and we're going to collectively for a couple of hours play social distancing, physical distancing kind of games with one another, just to kind of start brainstorming together as facilitators. So the Training Wheels warehouse, we happen to back up right to a middle school. So we are going to utilize their tennis courts and their open fields, and everybody bring whatever game, whether that has props to it or whether it doesn't, and then we'll figure that out. Now, one thing that I'm going to share my screen here and just walk through a couple of the other activities that I want to kind of walk through. So one of the activities that I love to do with groups is with, you know, just an icebreaker question exchange. So I have any type of question at Training Wheels. I have questions that I call icebreaker wheelies, and I just use that metaphorically as it's when you're in conversation with somebody, it's your turn at the wheel, and sometimes you're the driver and sometimes you're the passenger or the listener. So that's kind of where that metaphor comes from. But what I like to do, because I find that most people are comfortable sharing one-on-one with one another before they're comfortable with sharing in a large group, it warms them up to talking. So then therefore it also helps you when you go to debrief an activity, because now you've warmed people up a little bit. So that usually I give everybody one question and had them you go find a partner, ask each other the question, and then trade cards, and then go find the partner. So just like with Ubuntu cards or Spotted cards, then I'm going to have each person have 5 cards, and I will laminate everything again, so that way we aren't touching and spreading the germs on the props. And then I also find that whatever tools like this, whether it be Spotted, Ubuntu, whatever, things like this can be really cool. If you don't have a laminator and you still want to do this, then maybe instead of you know, recycling them later and that going into a landfill or anything like that, maybe let the participants go home with the props, because then it becomes an anchor tool back to the experience that they had in your program. And you'll be surprised at how people kind of get attached to that stuff a little bit, or then use it in your processing and debriefing. And then it becomes, so especially with the Ubuntu cards and the Spotted cards, because they've got the little images on it, now use that at the very end of your program, then use that as a processing and debriefing card. And then if they've made some sort of connection between an experience that they had in your program and one of the images on the card, then they get to take it home with them. And now there's some metaphorical emotional attachment to that, and then they might actually hang on to that as well and not throw it away. So, and if you're still worried about physical distancing and staying 6 feet apart, conversations can still be had. Standing 6 feet apart, they're just going to be a little louder. So for me, I plan on either doing programs outside or having a much bigger space to where people can make sure that we can spread out and still be about 6 feet apart from one another and still being able to have conversations. They're going to be a little bit louder and not as intimate, if you will, but I think we can still have them. So another idea that I have is to use Thumballs. Now, normally in programs, we would throw the ball across the circle to someone, everybody would be handling it, one person would catch it, and then they would look under their thumb and they would answer it. But instead of that, you could, maybe if I'm wearing gloves as the facilitator and I've disinfected it, I've actually tested out disinfectant and hand sanitizer on Thumballs, and it seems to be fine and it doesn't damage them. And so what I plan on doing is either wearing gloves, hand one to a participant, and then they become the one person that tosses the ball to themselves, and then they can, the participants, they could pretend almost like a virtual toss, and then you're gonna then they would answer. Somebody would toss the ball to themselves. They would look at it. It's like, all right, your question is going to be, what's your favorite cartoon? And then you would answer, and then someone would virtually pretend to throw the ball to somebody else, and then they would pretend to catch it, and then whoever has the ball, or if you're working with a small group, then you, the facilitator, can just be the one holding the ball and doing that for them. Kind of like what I've talked about, maybe even virtually. You can do this virtually with a group, to where I pretend to throw to somebody in my gallery view, and they pretend to catch it, and same thing kind of happens. So and if you don't have anything like this in your possession, you can create your own with a beach ball and Sharpie, and again, just disinfect it afterwards. But then it's still, the prop is still helping you and assisting you doing some of the work. And again, you can do it with a debriefing Thumball if you want to put review questions on a ball as well, or anything like that. The other thing you can do is just write numbers on a ball. And so if you do that, then maybe if you've got a PowerPoint, if you're in a classroom setting, then you could number your questions 1 through 12, and then you could either do some sort of do the Thumball, to where then they have to randomly answer that one, or they can pick a number. They can pick their favorite number. I want to go with number 7, one that hasn't been done before, or something like that. So so that would be a way to use Thumballs. And then an actual like team building kind of activity that you could do is a modified version of using playing cards, and again, laminating everything. I've already spent lots of time laminating cards. But group Blackjack, the way that I think I want to do this one, once we get everybody back into the same room and playing in the same room together again, is I think ahead of time, what I want to do is go in and either with masking tape or rope circles, or maybe even a raccoon circle, or a piece of webbing or something like that on the floor, a big enough piece that to where if 2 people were standing, 2 or maybe even 3 people were standing in this area, that they could still be far enough apart from one another to where they're not touching one another, but we could still tell who's going to be in a specific group. So this activity of group Blackjack is one that's in my Playing with the Full Deck book, and so this one is it's a silent activity. So you would first give everybody a card. Now, how you could do this again is if you had gloves and you tossed them out on the floor, and everybody could come up and pick up one card and tell them not to look at it. And this is a quiet activity, but basically you have everybody put the cards to their forehead, and they have to help one another get into small groups, that when you add up the cards in the small group, they come up with, that when you add them up, they equal a combined value of either 19, 20, or 21. And so then if it's preset little areas on the floor, then they could still be doing this. And so then you would kind of know, okay, those people are together. That's not just that one guy that's kind of randomly walking around looking for a group. If he's standing in a roped off area, or one of the masking taped off squares, then you know that those 3 people or 2 people are together. So that's kind of one idea of ways if I want people to be in a group, but I still want them to be, 4 to 6 feet apart, or 2 meters for my Australian friends, then I would just try to create those spaces ahead of time. So that way then I would probably look through what are the desired outcomes of the programs, and then trying to come up with activities to where I could use a lot of those spaces for different things that is still outcome focused. So we're still getting to the right parameters and the right outcomes that the client and the group wants to get to, and yet still sequencing it in a way that makes sense, starting out with an icebreaker and then coming in with something, but maybe I can use those same spaces for multiple activities. So that way we can give people X's on the floor to stand on, and so that way they're still having conversations, but certain areas apart from one another. So those are 3 of the main ideas that I had that I wanted to share, and then just again just reinforcing, laminating everything, and then just the spots on the floor. So.
And Michelle, are you using just a general hand sanitizer? What's the thing that you're using to disinfect? Is it something quite special that's been developed, or?
Yeah, not to mind. I plan on using Clorox wipes on things, hand sanitizers for hands, and then like Clorox wipes and other things like that on actual props themselves. That's my plan.
I know a number of the props, particularly if they're card-based, have some online or app-based variations. So the We Connect cards, for example, Climber cards, I think the Ubuntu cards are about to do the same thing. There would be some ways in which people already have a phone on them and they are the only ones who ever touch it. They would have a way of using and getting access to some of those questions.
That's true. Mark, I wonder if that that website, the card sorter one, that the random cards.
Yep.
I wonder if people could pull that up on their phones and then it hit it and they randomly could put their phone and the card up to their forehead.
Did that last week in small groups breakout. So I'll put that into the chat as we move on. But yeah, there's a number of sites out there that have freely available software for things like random cards, dice, questions, spinning wheels, so much stuff.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. All right. That was the little piece I wanted to add.
Awesome. Cool. All right, Claire, I'm going to toss to you. You're over here.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that, Michelle. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So it's my pleasure to, I suppose, introduce the next section of this, which will focus on the risk management side of it. So how do we achieve the valuable outcomes and the impact that we're looking to achieve in a way that obviously manages foreseeable risk? So just a brief bit about the organization that I work for, which will set the context and really explain some of the things, I suppose, that we've been doing, not as experts, but as trying to bumble our way through this, just like everybody else. So the outdoor education groups of for-profit, or for-purpose, not for profit, 440 odd staff, and you can see here large amount of participants, 50,000 a year. We had 200 programs postponed in 12 days. It felt like the domino just started, the calls started coming in, like probably many of you. And so that really put us in a horrendous position where, 97.5% of our staff had to be stood down. I think in the US, furloughed is the term you probably use. And so that was devastating. And I think for many of us, it was just one of those things that I work a lot in crisis management, and there's what we might term a routine crisis, and then there's a completely novel crisis. And that's what this was. There was no rule book. There was nothing to go on as to how to deal with this. So that really left, I suppose, a very skeleton crew of our team. And what that really meant for us is that we had to figure out how are we going to navigate this. And what I'm going to share is really looking at, we know a lot from risk management and some recent research that really what happens in the field is very heavily determined by what happens further upstream. So our program planning, our design of our programs. And really, I think that's really similar for a COVID-19 scenario as well, is how do we, exactly what Michelle and Mark just talked about, how do we actually set up for success to be able to deliver those types of activities and programs? And so really here's some things that I wanted to share with you. Right away, we established a task force, and we included in that task force, our lens was how do we make sure we're still here next year? So it was financial viability, it was sustainability of the organization, being around over 35 years. So that became our focus. And really, I think that was a strong and continues to be a strong anchor to make sure we're still here in 2021. We included the representation in that group from across the organization. So again, we know that I work at an executive level, but that gives me very minute focus in terms of our ability to see the whole organization. So if we talk about essentially all the different viewpoints and lenses of the organization. So we included some program planning staff, we included our operations crew. We defined areas of responsibility for this task force. So as you can see there, it focused very much on health and safety, on looking after our customers and our clients, on operations, the logistics, how do we actually get this place up and running again, on looking after our teams, and all of our team, very large organizations, so there's lots of folks to look after, especially as we know in a pretty uncertain and challenging time, and then also in our communications. So we really tried to define what areas really make up or comprise that task force. The group meets twice a week, and the other thing that's really been helpful, and I think it's so wonderful to see so many similar familiar faces and familiar voices and names in this group, is that those networks are really your lifeline. I think that's, these types of sessions, these types of collaborating with friends all over the world becomes, because none of us know this, none of us have the right answer. It's really, we're just trying to work it out. So I'd encourage you to certainly use all those diverse networks. So that then really helped us look at, we took an approach called P-. We've had some time on our hands. So really what that means is the program date minus however many weeks. So it helped us understand, what do we need? For example, we realized that our operations crew needs to be on board 4 weeks before a program. So in order for us to actually, so we essentially used a timeline approach. In order for us to run our first program, which at this point we're looking in August, for example, how many weeks before do we stand up our team again, for want of a better term? How long before that? So there was real thinking that has to be done so that we actually manage that foreseeable risk of starting up far too quick, not giving our team enough time to prepare, exactly the things that Mark and Michelle have been talking about. How do we set up our whole team for success so that when the program actually occurs, it actually resembles, a very high quality outdoor education program. So that was something that was helpful. And the other part of this really is taking a term risk communication approach. And risk communication is really, it's all about the person receiving the information. So there's a great old saying that it's not what you think that matters. So we know that how we perceive risk is influenced by many, many different things. And we know that, for example, if something's more familiar to us, we're more likely to accept it. If it's unfamiliar, we're more likely potentially to reject it. So COVID-19 is a classic example of that. What would it look like? What would a program look like post-COVID-19? So videos, speaking with our clients regularly, etc. So again, thinking about our customer versus it's not what you think that matters. We're doing this every day. It's very easy to get stuck in it and think everybody knows exactly what we're doing. And that's actually not the case. That's also vital for our staff, staff who are not working at this point, so that they actually, again, I think we talk about going down and in versus up and out. So really looking after whoever your end customer is or your client and helping them picture what it is that they might likely be signing up for. Then we get into the program delivery phase. So again, this is a term that the Australian government has been using, so phased and staged. And this was really helpful for us. Why was it helpful? Because it sort of helped us deal with the ambiguity or the overwhelmed aspect of starting up again. So we broke it into 3 phases, and that's really what we're working at the minute. So phase 1, where there's no overnight camps permitted. And so for us, I think many of the states now have just come out of this into what we term phase 2 in Australia. But initially for us, it was day programs only. We focused very much on what we rule out. So we focused on, raft builder is not going to happen because we can't design it in a way for us that was appropriate to maintain physical distancing. Participants would bring their own transportation, and there would be pre-health checks before leaving or upon arriving, so temperature checks, etc. As Mark talked about, pre-health declarations, so again, addressing all those areas. Regular sanitizing, regular cleaning, deep cleaning, etc. And what this really also helped us do is pilot. So we ran a couple of these programs now, and it really helped us kind of go, well, is this actually going to work? How are temperature checks going to work? How are our staff who are working on these programs going to, how do they have the information and the resources they need to be able to actually adequately provide the program in a way that I suppose doesn't take its soul away or its overall philosophy away. So I'd encourage that in terms of a pilot or trial approach. Then we've got phase 2. So for us, this is where when the Australian government, state government approves overnight camps. And so we're doing best guess scenario here. For example, we expect that there will be restrictions. We don't really know what they're going to be, but we're doing our best to sort of identify that and try and foresee that. So here's the stage that we add in activities, permitted activities. So for example, things like canoeing, orienteering, flying fox. In this phase, we're looking at 1 student per tent. Now for the size of our organization, that's pretty significant. And so what type of extra resources are we going to require? So we've been speaking with our tent manufacturing partners. We've been speaking to our suppliers, looking at your supply chain. Are you actually able to access the increased equipment that you might actually need? One of the nice things that's come out of this is also innovation. Is it possible to redesign, for example, are 3-person tents that we could put a divider in the middle and people sleep head to toe. And interestingly, One Planet, who are our tent provider, who've been brilliant, have designed a sort of innovative model for us that we're really looking at now as an interim for phase 2. I'm happy to send out some photos of that later as well. Online briefings. So again, we expect that we're not going to be doing big parent briefings in schools. There's not going to be assemblies. There's not going to be large gatherings. So how do we get innovative in our online briefings? How do we welcome our families back in our communities? Every student will have a personal hygiene kit. So again, looking and planning for that. And as Mark said earlier too, looking at the sharing, no sharing of equipment. So for example, if it's a canoeing trip, students' names on their own paddles, their PFDs, they have that the whole week. So we don't share that information. How do we set that up for students? Can we get creative with different color of tape? All those different things that help set us up, that there isn't any sharing of equipment and that we minimize that as much as we can. And then phase 3 is really where we supposedly get back to whatever this new normal is. So having those 3 different phases really helped us sort of break down the complexity in a way and break down the sense of overwhelmness. The other thing that I would suggest might be helpful is a timeline. And so this was really starting from the start of a program till the end of a program. So red, and then we went through and we said, okay, students arrive at school, get on the bus. So drive up, what do we do with the bus? How do we deal with the buses? Interestingly, the buses is one that everybody's just gone, oh, that's really too hard. How do we handle that? And that's one that we're looking at. So for phase 3, we're not expecting any restrictions on buses. For phase 2, it might be that we have to order multiple buses or students get their own way to camp, for example. Red, amber, green was a really helpful process for us to look through the lens. So red, is it possible? Red wasn't possible to implement appropriate physical distancing or COVID-19 risk management strategies. Amber was, you know what, we can do this activity or we can do this initiative that we're looking to do, but we have to modify it. And then green was, yep, she's right, it's all good. So again, it helped that sense of overwhelmness, and different people throughout the organization, the task force, would contribute to that. So really helpful. And then to take away, this one was it's probably still the biggest one. It's very confronting not knowing. We're living in a time of significant uncertainty. Importantly, I think it's important to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, but also try and really think about how do we break this down to be less confronting. And so things like timelines, etc., things like task forces, asking one of the questions we typically ask in the task force is, what are we worried about? What new things do we know now that we didn't know 3 days ago? Because of the changes, so having, it's psychologically safe to bring up our concerns. Using a project-based approach, this was a big one for us too. So again, you can imagine lots of our staff were unable to work because we lost so many programs. So of the folks who were left, they weren't necessarily in a role base anymore. So for example, my role, I'm doing things now that are completely different to what I was doing 3 months ago. What does that mean? I think taking a project-based approach really gets us out of that mindset of, well, I'm not sure, this wasn't my job, and focuses you to get into a function mode. So for example, one of my roles is to help plan for restarting the organization. So that's a discrete project. Or this project is about developing online content for our parents. So that's a discrete project. So again, some things to help take away the overwhelmness or the magnitude of it. I think this one's, significant in terms of, expect all of these things to occur. Expect the fear, the anxiety, the anger, the grief. Expect certainly for, the difference of folks who are working and folks who aren't working. All those things are extremely common because for us, this is the biggest risk event that we've ever lived through. And I think this one is probably the last important one. There's the principles. What principles are we looking to achieve or follow? What's our anchor through this? And again, to go right back to the start, for us, it was about the lens of sustainability and viability. Everything else has to be superfluous. Everything else has to be, that has to be your key focus. And of course, if we won't be sustainable if we don't keep in contact with our staff. we won't be sustainable or viable if we don't think about a phased and staged approach. We won't be sustainable or viable if we don't pace ourselves really well and look after ourselves. So certainly those were the big takeaways for an organization that, like many of you, are deep in it and trying to work out the best way forward.
That's great, Claire. Thank you. And I think Ken made this point in the chat as well. One of the benefits of having a staged approach is understanding that if there's a horrible outbreak, we've removed some of the ambiguity of going backwards. We're really clear what stage 1 was if we went into stage 2. So there's a benefit of going backwards as well by having that staged approach. In a moment, we're going to throw to you, Austin, but just a quick note for folks. If you were looking at the bottom of the screen that you have with Zoom, there's a Q&A button. And if you've got a question, I know some people are posting them in the chat, but it might be something you want to throw to the panel so that we can focus on it. Just add a question there, but also focus on some of the other questions and upvote them. If you go, oh yeah, I'd like to know the answer to that, that's a great feature that we can also introduce in this webinar time together as well. So between now and when we get to some Q&A, feel free to put a question in or upvote a question that you'd like to get answered. And with that, Austin, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. And Jim, Mark, excuse me, I really appreciate the opportunity to meet up with Claire and with Michelle and with all the other folks who are attending here. I wanted to say I appreciate the setup of the screening conversation that you began with, Mark, and Claire, the risk management considerations. I'm going to jump into the deep end when it comes to activity selection. I've selected one low ropes course activity so that we can actually look at it as an option. But what I wanted to say first was that really for Project Adventure, the start of all of this had to do with maintaining relationships. And I think that that's the origin of all of our intent here with regard to our clients and with our friends around the world. So maintaining those relationships was an important part. We decided not to actively go into adapting activities immediately, but we wanted to just reach out to our friends and find out how they're doing and what they're doing and how we might be able to be supportive of their efforts. And to that end, I have to say that Larry Childs here at Project Adventure has done an excellent job with reaching out to those clients and amassing quite a bit of information about what are school clients, what are camp clients doing, how do they intend to do it, and how might we be able to support that. So discussing things like what platforms were being used and how those platforms were being restricted by certain groups and what other applications might be most useful was a really important starting phase for us. And so that relationship piece has been so strong for us. Our client services folks have done an amazing job of maintaining those relationships throughout. So I'm going to just take a quick second here to share my screen. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. My mistake. Back we go here. And from current slide. Okay. So this is one of my favorite pictures. We've come a long way, haven't we?
Yeah.
Certainly so. And so the thing I really like about this picture is it reminds me of one of my mentors and long-term, and probably mentor for many of the people that are here on this podcast. Carl Rocky used to say quite a bit, how safe is safe enough, right? And it's a really difficult question to answer, and yet a very important question for us to be addressing. And I think that's where we're grappling right now. Put another way, I was speaking with Bob Ryan, our Director of Safety and Risk Management earlier today, and he sort of reminded me that risk that's inherent to the activities that we do, can be mitigated to some degree, but can't be eliminated. And we have to be careful when we do make changes to protocols, policies, because of unintended consequences that can certainly come up. And so I wanted to just sort of use that framing and use the framing that, okay, we're ready to go. We actually have clients who are calling us, want to come to our site, whether those clients are training clients at a particular organization, so that there's an intact group of people that understand that they have quarantined appropriately, that they're taking appropriate precautions, that they know each other, and we know them through our relationship and through our pre-screening with them. That's a very different circumstance than open enrollment programming, where you've got lots of people that are coming into that venue. So I want to make sure that that distinction is really clear in people's minds. We believe in the staged approach that Clare has mentioned. And so I'm coming at it from a stage 2 or stage 3 sort of approach, where clients have decided, whether it be in small groups of families, or whether it be in small groups of school-aged children, of coming to our sites, or whether it be in a training group that is going to be, that we're going to be attending either in a custom environment with their site or at our particular site. Okay, so the activity that I've chosen is a pretty common one for us. Everybody can recognize that. That's a multi-swing, or sometimes called in the old days a nitro crossing. This particular application is the disc jockey's sort of variation, where a group of participants swings from one location to another using the swing group. And in this particular application, you have people that are swinging into these particular hula hoops, or sometimes landing on a platform. Okay, I think we can see, looking at this picture, that some of the challenges that are presented in this COVID environment. So there are a few different options that we can have depending on our outcomes, our intentions, our relationships with our clients. The first is that we can confine each person to a particular hoop. We can use a rope that might have a basket or a bucket that's attached to it, that's swung from person to person, that each person then perhaps drops an item into that basket, a natural item, or it could be a personal, sort of an iconic personal item, or it could be a picture or a postcard, all of which then can't be touched, of course, but can be viewed by the rest of the team. And then during the subsequent discussion at the end, the value of those items that are in that bucket can be discussed. So something that can be done, perhaps maybe not as exciting. A second option then, depending on who our people are, what the outcomes are, is to individually swing to individual positions and encourage self-spotting. Self-spotting is that situation where we want to make sure that people are comfortable with the swing, that they've an opportunity to hang on the swing, and then finally that they know that if it's difficult for them, they can step down at any point. A facilitator may be provided for sort of brief near encounters if spotting is required, and in most cases that would be the case. Okay? The third, of course, is pre-identified cohort groups that are participating in the normal disc jockeys, with perhaps some increase in spacing between the groups. And so what is the common denominator of all of those? Well, part of what Michelle was talking about was this idea that we need to sanitize, we need to disinfect, we need to minimize the amount of direct contact that we have with our folks. And therein is sort of the crux of what we do. So much of what we do requires direct hand-to-hand sort of contact when it comes to spotting, or it comes to participating on these activities. Okay. Okay. So regarding the use of shared equipment, the risk really that's something that we're looking at is the key determinant is the viral loading. Science indicates that contact with surfaces such as ropes, particularly in outdoor settings, while certainly a concern and certainly something that we need to pay attention to, can really be best handled through frequent hand washing, masks, distancing, and in particular, management of small independent cohort groups. All right, so what you've seen there is a scaling of one activity that does require the use of a piece of shared equipment, but we're making the assumption based on science that the contact, the amount of viral loading that can happen in that particular situation is going to be at an absolute minimum. If we know our group, the groups are coming to us, we have these small groups that are staying separate and independent from one another, on the challenge course, that we should be able to mitigate the majority of risks in an outdoor environment through common sense types of activities that are being recommended to us through PPE and so forth. Oh, looks like my last slide got, so let's see. Okay. So I think really the main point that we're trying to make is that when we do begin to open up, that much of what we're trying to accomplish is knowing who it is that we're working with, knowing where they've been, knowing under what conditions they're coming to us, doing whatever appropriate pre-screening is necessary, as Mark has indicated. And we do have formats that we're developing for pre-screening of our clients prior to showing up and during the time that they would be attending with us. But that we think that by managing, using PPE, managing our small groups, that we'll be able to get back to some semblance of normalcy when it comes to these activities. Now, clearly, playgrounds are no longer open here in the United States. They're beginning to slowly open up, but this is something that we're particularly concerned about in terms of how these groups make it to our sites, how these groups move through our sites, as Mark had indicated, and managing the viral loading, which I think is probably the key component at this point. And at that, I hope to bring it to questions.
That's great. Thank you so much. To all of our panel, we have just a few minutes before the top of the hour, so there will be an official finish, and I'll make that very clear when we get there, but we may, with permission from the panelists, stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes to clear some of these questions. But if you would like now, if I can direct your attention to the Q&A tab, there are presently 25 questions, and some of them have been upped towards the top. So panel, perhaps you can open them as well, but I can read it to everybody for those who can't see it. Jennifer asked, wondering about the liability as a host in a contact tracing if a cluster is seen in your participants after attending. Obviously, rules differ by country, but wondering if any experiences yet there in Japan. So wondering about the liability as a host in a contact tracing. Thoughts on this, folks? Is this anything that OEG may have given some thought to, given the size and scale, Claire?
I would say if you already have your, I would say probably look into or ask your insurance provider about if they have any suggestions for you, because I think this is going to be probably more of a up to either your organization or your insurance provider. I know that for me, I have a couple of contracts that I have now had to re-sign or send out that have COVID protocols in them now. So I think I have one client in particular that we were supposed to do a program with them a couple months ago, so they postponed it until November, but now they want a COVID clause in the actual contract itself. So I would say it's going to probably depend on what your organization decides is the best thing for you, or what your insurance provider will also give their advice to you as well.
Claire?
Yeah, I'd agree with Michelle on that. I think that the jurisdictions are obviously very different. So in the US, it would be quite different to say here in Australia, in relation to how your organization protects itself. For us, it's, work health and safety legislation. So, really showing that you've taken due course to identify, manage and communicate all foreseeable risks involved. And I guess for me, it would be, certainly what we're looking at is, are we aware and adhering to the best, the standard advice? So from the government, from the Outdoor Council of Australia has put out some great advice. I know the American Camping Association has. So I think you look after yourself or your organization if you're aware and following the information that's known, and are you being, reasonable and prudent? So that would be my view, that that's really the test.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly the reasonable and prudent comment is most important here. Yeah, I would say that in the United States, because we have so many different jurisdictions that we have to attend to, that this is a particularly difficult question for clients and friends to answer. This really is a conversation that has to take place with your legal team. The idea of putting some information into a waiver form or putting some information into a pre-screening form, certainly is one that needs to be looked at. But I'm not sure that we have a very clear answer to that just yet.
Folks, it's the top of the hour, so we appreciate people's time. If you need to go, please do what you need to do. But if, with permission, and if our panel still has another 5 or 10 minutes, there may be another couple of questions that we can answer. It will be recorded if you wanted to catch this at another time, but you have my permission to leave if you need to. Thank you so much for being a part of our webinar today. We will stick around and answer a couple of more questions, but really appreciate that you joined us today. And there was well over 350, almost 400 of you here at one point. Panel, Heather asks the question, what harm versus good can come from updating what we say in terms of physical distancing versus social distancing? I know it's one that I've certainly adopted, moving away from social distancing, which just seems against what we are all about, and just using physical. So what sort of harm? How might we comment on that one? Heather asks. Everything we do is created in language. So from my point of view, changing the term made a lot of sense. It wasn't about socially distancing. I know it's the term that we've used in general society, but I intentionally moved it to physical distancing. Even in the context of promoting this webinar, it was about physical distancing measures, not social. Claire?
Yeah, totally agree. I think so many of us probably are of the feeling that never has it been more important to be actually socially close and proximal to each other. So it makes a lot of sense, and it's I think language, certainly language in everything we do is so important and deliberate. So and defining the difference between the two, I think, is very helpful in our communication with our communities as well.
Yeah, I've tried using the phrase social distancing, staying virtually connected, right? So but keeping the connected in there. Otherwise, I think we are at a real danger of becoming a very distanced society. And that, I think, is going to come with a lot of mental issues later for people when we do are able to start being in the same room. And also, I think we also as facilitators just have to be prepared for those people that really are going to be uncomfortable with some of the things we ask them to do that maybe we think is okay, but for them, they don't.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have to be very accommodating and very like, you're totally fine. Like, please participate at the level of comfort that you have that's going to be appropriate for you. Now, that doesn't give people permission just to go over to the side and be on their phones and, do other things, right? Figure out a way that you can still stay connected to what we're doing and to the message and to the intent behind what we're doing in a way that feels safe for you. So.
Yeah, we used to think that just inviting people to hold hands was an issue. I don't want to hold hands. Well, it takes on a whole new context now, doesn't it?
Right.
Certainly does.
Anything else? Otherwise, I'll move on to a couple of other questions. Where is it? Any tips or ideas around small group cooking, Cameron asks, on stoves and fires in the outdoors? So tips and ideas around small group cooking on stoves and fires in the outdoors. Have your organizations ruled it out? What's OEG or PA doing in that context? I know I'm not doing that sort of stuff typically.
Yeah, this is a bit like the bus in a way. This, some of the things that we're looking at for our phase 2. So what I explained earlier when we start up again is, again, very similar, like small group, the 3 people, for example, with trench stoves, that they will stay in that group for the entire week, that their gear will be obviously, and their equipment will be marked. That's theirs, that becomes part of them. That the staff members essentially hover. So, hover are there able to intervene if a health and safety reason, but certainly that the groups are spread out, small groups, and that they keep their equipment with them. That's really what we're trialing at the minute. For the younger kids, we're trialing essentially that the adults will do the cooking. And so that there'll be minimal people around a stove and around the cooking equipment, obviously with the hygiene and the sanitation, everything like that built in. But that's what we're planning at the moment.
Yeah, those protocols are pretty similar to what we're looking to implement, or at least try out before we implement. We don't do any cooking either, but the relevance of a belay rope and belay equipment becomes really important. And the rotations, Claire, that you're mentioning is certainly going to be consistent with that. Individuals have their own PPE, which also includes helmets, harnesses, hardware. But the belay rope is sort of the tricky one. And there are ways that we can manage that by having additional belay ropes, by minimizing the use of belay ropes, by keeping our cohorts nice and small. But again, by the time we get to this point, we recognize that that the screening process, the self-screening and pre-screening process, is going to be the thing that really provides the most reasonable, logical protection for us, as well as the additional sanitation of hands and hand washing in particular.
Yeah. Hey, perhaps following on from that then, a question from Indonesia. Gita, thanks for your question. A question for Dr. Clare, but I think it's for the panel. If we already do this, all the procedures that you mentioned in your presentation, after the camp, 14 days later, someone gets sick, how do we as the organizer handle that? Do we need, screen refreshed, do we need to make contact with the parents and the organizer? Can they sue us? Hear the liability embedded into the question, but what's some thoughts there?
Austin, do you want to take that first and then I'll jump in?
Sure, yeah, why not? The point about liability is really difficult at this particular stage. I'm taking a sort of a legal writing course right now, and it's interesting doing research into these kinds of things where we don't have any standards, where we don't have any case studies, for example. It's going to be tough for the courts to negotiate that. So this is where the prudent professional sort of framing comes into play. What is the sort of common practice that's taking place within the industry? And most of that common practice, I think, really has to do with making sure that we're conveying information to our clients, to our friends, in as thorough a way as we can, both ahead of time and then when we're there again. Because when we're there again, Michelle brought up a good point about sort of challenge by choice, that how people choose to interact once they're together is important to negotiate. So that whole norming process with these new protocols is going to be an essential part of what we do. Whether it's in a waiver or whether it's in pre-information, whether we actively have an actual checklist, those are all things that we are intending to do, but we still need some further guidance about.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think I take the view that this is entirely foreseeable. This is the world that we're living in. And so in a way, I would design my communications, I would design my practice, I would design my training, I would design my review of training or my review of the first few weeks. That's why I'm very keen on the idea of a pilot, so that we remain flexible. And, the word of COVID, pivot, that we can literally be agile and change quickly. And I think that part is that we don't go into this with a fixed, let's go back to this, a fixed mindset, exactly what we try and teach. So I would expect that mistakes will be made, expect that things won't go according to plan. But if we take a step back from that and think about, who our customer is, what, as Austin said, over communicate. So really thinking about the various phases. We're talking about the planning and design, what needs to be taken into place there, and then into delivery. And really, if you can demonstrate that, due care and attention has been taken, unfortunately, whether or not it goes to liability, sometimes it's just out of your hands. That's just the reality of the situation. I think a number of years ago when I moved into risk management, I realized that I can either take a fear approach to being a risk manager or a leader, or I can take an empowered approach, do the best I can, have a great network around me, look at the various policies, procedures, look at the best possible advice, and put my customer first. And I think that's what sets you up for success.
Yeah, I think another thing to consider is also, now that everybody knows how to do Zoom, because everybody's probably been on at least one Zoom call in the last couple months, is do a pre-Zoom. Or do a pre-program with your clients and let them see you and get to meet you in this format first, and then walk them through, here's what we're planning on doing to make sure that we still have some fun, still get to the outcomes that we wanted to do, and we're going to do it in a safe way. And this is what we planned. It's going to be a lot more work on our part to do that, and it's going to probably help show good faith towards this is what we're planning on doing to help keep the environment safe, both physically safe, emotionally safe. This is what we want to do. And then even do a couple icebreakers, maybe even with them, let them get to know one another in this format first before we ever get live and in person. And I think that would greatly help as well.
Certainly.
Go for it.
I was going to say, just I wanted to ditto what Michelle said. I think certainly even before all this COVID phenomenon took place, PA was really trying to focus heavily on reaching into the client environment, understanding their particular environment, and then after the event, reaching back into their environment and giving them ways to sort of segue and transition back. So I so appreciate that comment, Michelle.
It's like an unofficial start, Michelle. You know, it actually sets them up for success. It helps them engage with you. It just makes a lot of sense. It's just a different medium, absolutely, but the concept is the same.
Exactly.
We're going to bring us to our last question, folks, as a panel and for our attendees, respecting people's time. And I know I can kick off with a response to this. Jennifer asked, what sessions or content have you found to be newly relevant or resonating for people in this time? And she said, dealing with the ambiguity Claire mentioned made me think of this. So for me, I've identified the work that I'm doing online to a virtual audience is exactly the same as what I'm doing in person. And this is the part that's resonating for people, is they've got so caught up in the black hole that was this camera that all we ended up focusing on in a virtual audience was our content. And we forgot to bring our humanity. And so for me, the intentionality, whether you're in person or in a virtual audience, was still critical. If you didn't bring intentionality to help people connect online, then it was just as bad as when you didn't bring it when they were in person. So for me, people have gone, oh yeah, you're right. That's really important. It's not about the content. It was about those opportunities to connect. So that's newly relevant. I think it's always been there, but newly relevant given this new medium that we're working with and the black hole that we're all looking at right now. Other thoughts? Anything else?
I think probably the only thing I would sort of add to that is I think this is a very refreshing opportunity to go back to, you know, the innovation around what impact are we hoping to achieve, and you know, in many ways this whole situation affords us the opportunity to look at things differently. Never in my wildest dreams would I think we'd have a divider in a tent, for example, and that, you know, that we could have wonderful, you know, the value of relationships prior to COVID-19 pay dividends during crises. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's one of the most refreshing things about this is that, you know, this looking into this black hole is our community, and we can still, in a way, probably have, you know, the more of a community connection that I think I've ever had with my tribe through this experience.
Mm-hmm. For example, we've never worked before until now. We're
right.
Online, Claire.
That's right.
The same for this group of 4 people. Anything else to add before I close off, folks? For that.
I'll just add one more thing, and it has to do with networking again that was discussed earlier in this. I think that networking is the key to all of this. I think that if you folks have challenge courses, and I'm at this point I'm talking about challenge courses particularly because that was my role within this group. If you have challenge courses, reach out to your folks, reach out to your neighbors, reach out to your vendors, and understand that agencies having jurisdiction here are pretty varied, and it can be very difficult and complicated to move from one sort of layer of jurisdiction to another. It also can be a really great opportunity for you to better understand those connective tissues between standard setters and standard sort of enforcers, so to speak, when it comes to state and federal guidelines. So it's become very interesting from a risk management perspective, and I would say that in and of itself is worth putting time and effort into sort of rethinking about.
Well, thank you, folks. Thank you to the 200 or more people who have stuck around to the end, but to all of the people who registered and attended today. But big thanks especially to the gorgeous people that are on your screen right now. Big thanks to Claire and Michelle and to Austin for giving up and donating your time to share so generously with all of this, our community, this international community. In the follow-up email, folks, that I will send out to everyone, hopefully in the next sort of 10 hours, I will have contact details for all of these folks if you would like to reach out to them. And I know there was a number of questions in the chat, Michelle, I know you would have seen this too. You've got another webinar coming up of a similar topic next week. Do you want to briefly just tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. So next Thursday, June 11th here in the US, anyway, I guess that would be the same for you all. But at 3 p.m. Mountain Time, I live in Denver, so I'm doing one, just an activities webinar on team building from 6 feet apart. So that is open to, I'm going to have up to 1,000 people in the through my Zoom account. So feel free to register for that ahead of time. You can find it on the Training Wheels Facebook page. The link is also in the chat box, and Mark will include it in the email out to everybody. But a week from now, then that will be another, just kind of what I did earlier with those 3 activities, and plus a whole bunch more. And I will have a handout with instructions and everything like that, just trying to push as much information out to help people as we start to prepare going back to in-person programs.
So team building from 1.8 meters away, if you're in other parts of the world. Misinterpret in your own fashion.
Right.
So let me just check my notes, make sure I've got everything I said. Yeah, so we will send out links, folks, to the video. I will find ways to also share the chat, unless, of course, you've captured all the information you had. Again, big thanks to everybody. I'll stick around for anyone who is, you probably all find this yourself. Are there any questions? No hands go up. As soon as the bell rings, everyone comes to the front of the room to ask you a question. So I will stick around. No one else needs to. If they list, they need to. But thank you so much, folks. Thank again to each of our panelists for giving up your time and effort in sharing. And I look forward to us when we all get together again some other time.